He was digging his own grave, and the whole town of Redemption was watching. The earth, a stubborn mix of clay and frost-hardened dirt, fought him with every shovelful. Jedediah's hands, once calloused from roping cattle and mending fences, were now raw and bleeding, the shovel handle slick with a grim mixture of sweat and blood. He didn't feel it. He didn't feel the wind that tore across the prairie, a bitter, tooth-filled thing that promised a merciless winter. He didn't feel the stares of the townsfolk who gathered at a safe distance, their faces a pale tapestry of pity, scorn, and morbid fascination. He felt only the rhythmic pull and heave of his own muscles, a penance and a prayer rolled into one. The hole was for him. A man-sized rectangle carved into the unforgiving land at the edge of his own failing ranch, just beyond the last crooked fence post that marked the boundary of a life that had crumbled to dust. His wife, Mary, and their daughter, Little Dove, were already in the ground, resting in the churchyard behind a neat white fence he could no longer bear to look at. They had been taken by the fever in the spring, a swift, merciless reaping that had left him with nothing but the echoing silence in his cabin and the scent of rosemary that clung to his wife's abandoned shawl. For weeks he had wandered his own land like a ghost, the cattle growing thin, the fields lying fallow. Then, one morning, he had picked up the shovel. He had started digging. It was the only work that made sense. A final chore. A last act of a man closing his own accounts. Sheriff Brody stood by his horse, chewing on a piece of straw, his face impassive. He had tried talking to Jedediah on the first day. "Son, what you're doing ain't right," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. Jedediah hadn't answered. He'd just kept digging. Brody saw no law being broken, only a heart, and the law had no jurisdiction over a man's grief. So he watched like everyone else, as Jedediah methodically, suicidally, excavated his own tomb. The hole grew deeper. It was almost to his chest now. The children in the crowd whispered, their mothers hushing them with sharp tugs on their arms. The men just shook their heads. They'd seen men break before, but never like this. It was a slow, public unraveling, a spectacle of sorrow. The sun was a weak, watery eye in the gray sky, beginning its slow descent. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and coming snow. Jedediah paused, leaning on his shovel, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He looked down into the dark space he had made. It looked peaceful, quiet, an end to the echoes. He closed his eyes, picturing Mary's smile, hearing Dove's laughter one last time. It was enough, he was ready. And then a new shadow fell across the mound of displaced earth. It was long and thin, and it did not belong to any of the silent watchers. Jedediah didn't open his eyes. Perhaps it was the angel of death, come to see his work was done. He had prayed for it, in his own silent way. A voice, raspy and low, cut through the wind. It was not the voice of an angel. It was the voice of a woman. That's deep enough. Jedediah's eyes snapped open. Standing at the edge of his grave was a woman he had seen, but never spoken to. She was an outsider, one of the wagon train folk who had washed up in Redemption, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a haunted look in her eyes. Her name was Alara, he'd heard someone say. Her husband had died of cholera on the trail, and she was left with 2 small children who clung to her skirts like burrs. Her dress was worn, the fabric thin enough to show the sharp angles of her shoulders. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes burned with a fire he thought had been extinguished from the world. They were the color of a stormy sky, and right now they were fixed on him with an intensity that pinned him to the spot. Behind her, 2 small children shivered, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wide and frightened. One, a boy of about 6, held a rock in his small fist as if it were a weapon. The other, a girl no older than 4, hid her face in the folds of her mother's skirt. Jedediah stared, confused. He had become a part of the landscape, a feature of the town's daily gossip. People watched him, but no one spoke to him anymore. No one dared to step this close. Ilara took a step forward, the worn leather of her boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt. "I said," she repeated, her voice stronger now, carrying over the wind to the stunned onlookers, "that's deep enough." He found his voice, a rusty croak. "This ain't your concern, ma'am." "A man digging his own grave in the middle of the road is everyone's concern," she shot back. "Especially when there's work to be done." He scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. "I'm done with work." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound of chilling finality. "You're not." She glanced back at her children, then her gaze returned to him, hard as iron. "My husband is dead. My savings were stolen by a man who promised me a room and then vanished. The banker who owns the boarding house says we'll be out on the street by morning. My children haven't eaten a full meal in 2 days. I have nothing. No home, no food, no hope." She paused, letting the brutal weight of her words settle in the cold air between them. "I look at you, and I see a man who has a home, who has land, who has the strength to dig a hole this deep in frozen ground. And you want to throw it all away and sleep in the dirt." Her words were not pleading. They were sharp, pointed stones of accusation. He felt a flicker of anger, the first real emotion besides grief he'd felt in months. "You know nothing about me." "I know you're giving up," she said. "I know you're giving up." Voice raw, "And I will not allow it. Because if you give up, what hope is there for the rest of us?" She took another step, right to the crumbling precipice of the grave. She looked down into it, then back at him. Her next words were not a proposal. They were a verdict, a life sentence. "So here is the choice. You can lie down in that hole right now, and I will take that shovel from your hands. I will stand here, and I will fill it with dirt, and I will say a prayer for your soul. And then my children and I will freeze to death on your land. Or you can climb out of there. You can put down that shovel. And you can help me survive. You can give us a roof. I will cook, I will clean, I will mend. I will work this land with you until my fingers bleed. We will fight the winter together. We will fight the hunger together. We will fight the ghosts together." The town was utterly silent. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. Jedediah stared up at her, at this fierce, desperate, half-starved woman who was offering him not comfort, not solace, but a war. She was offering him a reason to live that was as brutal and demanding as his reason for wanting to die. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a core of steel. She was not asking him to save her. She was commanding him to save himself for her sake. He looked from her face to the faces of her children. The little boy was no longer holding the rock. His fist had unclenched, and he was staring at Jedediah with an expression of profound, heartbreaking hope. It was an expression he hadn't seen since Little Dove. Something inside him, a tectonic plate of grief that had been locked in place for months, shifted. It was a painful, grinding movement that sent a tremor through his entire body. He looked at his raw hands, at the shovel, at the dark, waiting earth. Then he looked back at Ilara, at the family standing on the edge of his abyss. Slowly, deliberately, he stabbed the shovel into the mound of dirt. He placed one bloody hand on the edge of the grave, then the other. With a groan that was part pain and part something else entirely, he pulled himself up, out of the darkness, and into the fading light. He stood before her, covered in the dirt of his own intended tomb, his chest heaving. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Ilara held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. She turned, gathering her children, her hands gentle but firm on their small shoulders. "Come," she said to them, her voice soft for the first time. Jedediah watched them for a second, a man resurrected against his will. Then, leaving the shovel standing like a grave marker, he turned and followed them. He walked away from the hole, away from the watching town, and toward the cold, silent cabin that he had intended never to enter again. The long, brutal war had just begun. The cabin was a museum of sorrow. Dust lay thick on every surface, a soft gray shroud over Mary's rocking chair, over the small wooden toys Dove had left scattered on the floor. The air was stale with the smell of disuse and decay. A half-eaten plate of beans, now covered in a pale blue fur of mold, sat on the table where he'd left it weeks ago. It was a place where life had stopped. Ilara entered without hesitation, her children trailing behind her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. This derelict cabin to them was a palace compared to the single drafty room they had been living in. Ilara surveyed the scene, her lips tightening into a thin line. She was not daunted. She was a general surveying a battlefield. "Boy," she said, her voice crisp. Her son, whose name Jedediah would later learn was Caleb, looked up at her. "Fetch water from the well. As much as you can carry. Girl, the little one Sarah, you will gather any wood you can find that is dry, small pieces, twigs, anything." The children, accustomed to her commands, scurried out to obey without a word. She turned to Jedediah. He was standing in the doorway, a lost, hulking figure, seemingly unsure of what to do in his own home. He looked like a stranger. "The fireplace," she said, pointing. "The flue needs to be cleared, and we need a fire that will burn through the night." For the next few hours they worked in a charged, almost complete silence. The only sounds were the scrape of metal as Jedediah cleaned the chimney, the frantic scrubbing as Ilara attacked the grime on the floorboards with a bucket of well water and a rag, and the crackle of the fire as it finally caught, spitting and hissing to life. The children worked alongside them, their small faces grim with determination. They were a small, desperate army against the encroaching cold and darkness. Jedediah moved like a man in a dream, his actions mechanical. He was obeying her commands because it was easier than thinking, easier than feeling. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached, the clean, sharp scent of pine, a painful reminder of winters past, of fires he had built for Mary. He hauled water until the muscles in his back screamed. He did not look at Ilara, and she did not look at him. They were two planets orbiting the same dying sun of their grief, their paths parallel but never touching. That night, they ate a thin stew she made from a handful of dried beans she'd carried in her pocket and some withered carrots she'd found in his neglected root cellar. They ate from wooden bowls, sitting on the floor around the fire, the flickering light casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The children ate ravenously, their eyes never leaving their bowls. When they were done, Ilara laid the children down on a pile of old blankets near the hearth, the warmest spot in the cabin. She tucked them in, her movements efficient and tender. Jedediah watched from the shadows. He saw the way she smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead, the way she rested a hand on her son's back until his breathing evened out in sleep. The sight was a knife in his gut. It was so familiar, so achingly, beautifully familiar. He had to turn away, his throat tight. He went to the corner of the cabin where his cot was, intending to fall into the oblivion of exhaustion. "You sleep there." Ilara's voice came from behind him. He turned. She was pointing to the large bed, the one he had shared with Mary, the one he hadn't slept in since she died. "No," he said, the word torn from him. "I can't. The children." "And I will take the floor by the fire," she stated, not looking at him. "That is your bed. This is your house. We are here by your grace. We will not take your bed." It was a statement of fact, but it felt like a challenge, a test. He looked at the bed, at the hand-stitched quilt Mary had made, its colors faded, but still vibrant. To sleep in it alone felt like the ultimate betrayal, but to refuse felt like... what? He didn't know. He was navigating a new country, and he didn't know the language or the laws. Wordlessly, he walked to the bed and lay down on top of the quilt, still fully clothed. He stared up into the darkness, listening to the sound of the fire, the sigh of the wind outside, and the soft, even breathing of the woman and her 2 children sleeping on his floor. He did not sleep. He lay there, rigid and awake, a sentinel guarding a tomb that was no longer empty. The days that followed were a blur of relentless, back-breaking work. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity, not comfort. They were partners in survival, not companions. Their conversations were sparse, functional. The axe needs sharpening. There's a leak in the roof of the barn. We're low on flour. The silence between them was vast and deep, filled with the ghosts of their unspoken losses. He taught Caleb how to check the snares he had long ago abandoned. The first time the boy came running back, a rabbit clutched in his hands, his face alight with pride, Jedediah felt another one of those painful, internal shifts. He saw not just a boy, but a provider. He saw resilience. Ilara was a force of nature. She scrubbed the cabin until it gleamed. She mended his torn shirts with small, neat stitches that spoke of a life before this one. She found a small patch of earth protected from the wind and, with a ferocity that amazed him, began to prepare it for a winter garden, covering it each night with burlap sacks. She found his wife's old spinning wheel in the attic, cleaned, and began to card the wool from the few neglected sheep he still owned. She was not just occupying the space. She was reclaiming it from the clutches of his grief. There were moments of clumsy tenderness that felt as loud as shouts in the quiet cabin. One evening, he saw her wincing as she kneaded dough, her knuckles raw and chapped from the lye soap and the cold. The next morning, he left a small tin of his wife's lanolin salve on the table beside the flour bin. He said nothing. When he came in from the fields that night, the tin was gone, and the bread she had baked was richer, softer than usual. It was a language they were inventing, a dialect of shared burdens and small unspoken kindnesses. But the pain was always there, a phantom limb. Sometimes he would see her staring into the fire, her eyes distant, and he knew she was seeing her husband's face in the flames. Sometimes she would catch him standing by the window, looking out toward the churchyard, and a silent understanding would pass between them. They were both haunted, and their ghosts now shared a home. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, weeping. She was holding one of Dove's old wooden dolls, which she must have found while cleaning. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. Jedediah stood there, his hands useless at his sides. The old him, the him before Mary, would have known what to do, what to say. This new, broken version of him was paralyzed. He wanted to comfort her, to put a hand on her shoulder, but it felt like a trespass. It felt like he would be touching a wound that was not his to heal. So he just stood there, a silent witness to her sorrow, until she finally looked up and saw him, her face crumpled with shame. She quickly wiped her eyes and stood up, placing the doll carefully back on the shelf. "The cow is low on milk," she said, her voice thick but steady, and she walked past him out of the barn. The moment was over, but it left a crack in the wall of silence between them. They had seen the depths of each other's pain, and they had not run away. The town of Redemption did not know what to make of the arrangement at the Jedediah ranch. It was the main topic of gossip at the general store, over sewing circles, and in the saloon. She just walked in and took over, one woman whispered to another over a bolt of calico. "Shameless." He was out of his mind with grief, her husband countered, weighing a bag of nails. "She's probably taking advantage. Probably sell the ranch out from under him once she gets his signature on a piece of paper." Mr. Henderson, the banker, a man whose heart was as hard and small as the gold coins he kept locked in his safe, was particularly displeased. He had been circling Jedediah's ranch like a vulture, waiting for the man to drink himself to death or finally lie down in that Ridiculous grave so he could foreclose and sell the land to the railroad company that was sniffing around. This woman, this Alara, was an unwelcome complication. When Jedediah and Alara came to town for supplies, a rare and necessary journey, the Whispers would follow them down the dusty main street. They walked side by side, Caleb and Sarah trailing. Behind them, a strange makeshift family. They did not hold hands. They did not smile. They presented a united, unreadable front. They would enter the general store, their list concise, their interactions with the owner, Mr. Gable, brief and professional. "Need a sack of flour, 50 pounds, Jedediah would say, his voice low, "and salt. And 2 bars of soap," Alara would add, her eyes meeting Mr. Gable's without flinching. Mr. Gable, a man caught between town opinion and his own ledger, would hesitate. "Credit's getting a bit high, Jedediah." "The work is getting done," Jedediah would reply, his gaze steady. "The land will produce. You'll be paid." His voice held a new authority. It was quiet, but it was not the voice of the man who had been digging his own grave. It was the voice of a man with something to protect. Reluctantly, Gable would nod and add the items to their account. But there were small pockets of solidarity, too. The blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Olson, a stout woman with kind eyes who had lost a child of her own years ago, saw them one day. She watched as Alara knelt to retie Sarah's shoelace, her movements patient and sure. She saw the way Jedediah stood guard, his stance protective, his eyes scanning the street. Later that week, a pail of fresh, creamy milk appeared on their porch before dawn. There was no note. The doctor, a weary man who had seen too much death, saw Caleb and Sarah playing in the yard. He noted the new color in their cheeks, the way their laughter, thin at first, was growing stronger. He tipped his hat to Jedediah in a silent gesture of approval that was worth more than 1,000 whispered words. The turning point came during a Sunday service they did not attend. The preacher, a fiery man named Reverend Michael, spoke of charity and Christian duty, his sermon pointedly aimed at the gossip that had been festering in his congregation. After the service, as the townsfolk gathered outside, Henderson the banker made a show of his disapproval. "It's an unholy arrangement," he declared to a small crowd. "A woman of loose morals taking up with a madman. It sets a poor example for the community. And what of those children? They should be with proper, God-fearing people." From the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Olson spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "I seem to recall the good book saying something about caring for widows and orphans, Mr. Henderson. Or does your version only have pages about collecting debts?" A few people chuckled. Henderson's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. "And as for madness," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, "it seems to me that choosing to live is a far saner choice than choosing to die. That woman didn't drag Jedediah down. She stood at the edge of his grave and dared him to climb out. I'd call that a damn sight more Christian than anything I've seen from you." The crowd grew quiet. They looked at each other, the seeds of doubt planted in the fertile ground of their judgment. They had seen Jedediah's despair. They had seen Alara's destitution. And now they were seeing something new growing between them. Not love, not passion, but a stubborn, defiant kind of hope. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they began to change. The scorn was slowly, grudgingly, turning into a wary kind of respect. They were still outsiders, but they were no longer just a tragedy. They were a story. And everyone was waiting to see how it would end. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the prairie in a pristine, unforgiving white. The world shrank to the confines of the small ranch. The work moved indoors. Jedediah repaired harnesses and tools in the barn, the rhythmic rasp of his file a steady heartbeat against the silence. Alara sat by the fire, her hands always busy, spinning wool, mending clothes, teaching Sarah her letters. The cabin, once a cold tomb, was now filled with the smell of baking bread, wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of wool. It was filled with life. The bond between them deepened in the crucible of that shared isolation. They began to talk, not just about chores, but about things that mattered. He told her about his father, who had taught him how to read the land, to know when a storm was coming by the color of the sky. She told him about her mother, who had taught her which plants could heal a fever and which could soothe a cough. They never spoke directly of Mary or of Ilara's husband. Their ghosts were still there, sitting with them in the firelight, but they were no longer angry specters. They were quiet, sad presences, memories that were slowly being woven into the fabric of this new strange life. One night, a blizzard descended, a howling vortex of wind and snow that shook the cabin to its foundations. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow piled up against the door. Jedediah and Ilara stayed up all night, feeding the fire, listening to the storm rage. The children slept soundly, secure in the warmth and safety of the little fortress their mother and this strange, sad man had built. In the deep hours of the morning, with the storm at its peak, Ilara looked at Jedediah across the hearth. "Were you really going to do it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Lie down in that hole?" He stared into the flames for a long time before he answered. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. There was nothing left. The world was quiet. "Too quiet." "It's still quiet," she said softly. He looked at her strong, tired face illuminated by the fire. He looked at the two sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "No," he said, and he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "No, it's not." The arrival of the circuit judge was an event in redemption. He came twice a year to dispense justice, settle land disputes, and legitimize the raw, often brutal, facts of frontier life. And this time, Mr. Henderson the banker was ready for him. He saw his opportunity not just to get the land he coveted, but to crush the defiant little family that had become a symbol of hope for some, and a source of irritation for him. He filed a formal petition with the court. It was a cruel, carefully worded document. It claimed that Jedediah Miller, due to profound and public mental instability as evidenced by his attempt to bury himself alive, was unfit to manage his own property. It further claimed that Ilara, a woman of unknown origin and questionable character, was an unsuitable guardian for her two minor children, forcing them to live in an unholy and unstable environment. The petition requested that the court declare Jedediah incompetent, seize the Miller Ranch for public auction to settle his debts, and place the children, Caleb and Sarah, in the state orphanage for their own safety and moral well-being. The news spread through the town like a prairie fire. The hearing was to be held in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd that was sure to gather. It was to be a public trial, not just of Jedediah and Ilara, but of the very idea of their family. When Sheriff Brody delivered the summons to the ranch, his face was grim. Jedediah read the document, his face turning to stone. Ilara read it over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. This was the attack she had always feared. Not the wind, not the hunger, but the cold, cruel hand of the law, wielded by a man like Henderson. "He can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jedediah folded the paper, his knuckles white. He looked at Caleb and Sarah, who were watching them, their faces clouded with a fear they didn't understand. He looked at the home they had fought so hard to build from the ashes of their lives. For months, he had been fighting to survive. Now he understood. He had to fight to live. "He can try," Jedediah said, and in his eyes, a fire that had been banked for almost a year roared back to life. The day of the hearing, the saloon was packed. The entire town was there, their faces a sea of conflicting emotions: curiosity, pity, malice, and a tense waiting anticipation. Henderson sat at the front beside his lawyer, a slick man from a bigger city, looking smug and confident. Jedediah and Ilara sat alone at a table on the other side. Ilara's hands were clasped. So tightly in her lap they were bloodless. Jedediah sat straight and tall, his eyes fixed on the judge, a weary-looking man named Davies with a reputation for being tough but fair. Henderson's lawyer began, his voice smooth and condescending. He painted a vivid picture of Jedediah's madness, calling witnesses who described the grave digging in lurid detail. He described Jedediah as a broken, irresponsible man, a danger to himself and others. Then he turned his attention to Ilara. He called her a vagrant, an opportunist. He twisted their arrangement into something sordid and ugly. This woman, he said, pointing a dramatic finger at Ilara, saw a vulnerable man, a wealthy landowner, and she latched onto him. She has insinuated herself into his home, and we have no proof of her marital status, no knowledge of her past. Are these the hands we want raising innocent children? In a house of grief and sin? Ilara flinched as if struck. Jedediah's hand moved to cover hers on the table, a small, firm gesture of solidarity. Finally, the lawyer called Ilara to the stand. She walked slowly, her head held high, though Jedediah could see the slight tremor in her hands. Mrs. The lawyer began, letting the title hang in the air, a deliberate insult. You claim to be a widow? I am a widow, Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear. And you have no family, no means of support? My husband is buried on the plains. My family is in a country I will never see again. The only means of support I have are my own 2 hands. And the charity of a mentally unstable man, the lawyer sneered. Tell me, what exactly is the nature of your relationship with Mr. Miller? Ilara looked not at the lawyer, but at the judge. Then her eyes swept over the faces in the crowd. The people who had whispered about her, judged her. I will tell you, she said, her voice gaining strength. When I came to this town, I had lost everything a person can lose. I stood on the edge of nothing. I was invisible. People looked through me, or they looked at me with pity, which is worse. Then I heard about the man digging his own grave. And I went to see him. She paused, her gaze finding Jedediah. I did not see a madman. I saw a man drowning in a pain so deep there were no words for it. I saw myself. He had a home he could no longer see as a shelter. I had children I could no longer feed. He had given up on life. I was being crushed by it. Her voice grew raw with emotion, and the saloon was utterly silent. So I made him a bargain. I did not offer him comfort. I offered him work. I offered him a reason to get through the next hour, the next day. I did not save him, and he did not save me. We simply chose to stand in the wind together rather than be blown away alone. We chose to build something. You can call that sin, if you like. I call it survival. You can call this house unsuitable. My children call it home. She finished, her chest heaving, tears shimmering in her eyes but not falling. A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Davies looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, Mr. Miller, would you care to speak? Jedediah stood up. He did not go to the witness stand. He stood by his table, a towering, solid presence. He looked at Henderson, at his lawyer, and then, like Ilara, he addressed the whole town. For 6 months after my wife and daughter died, he began, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. This house was not a home, it was a tomb. The silence was so loud it was like a scream that never ended. Every day I woke up and the only thing I could think to do was to join them. So I started digging. He looked down at his hands, still calloused, but clean now. Healed. You all watched me. And you were right to think I was mad. Grief is a kind of madness. He lifted his head, and his eyes were blazing. And then she came. This woman. She didn't offer pity. She didn't offer prayers. She stood at the edge of the hole I was digging for myself, and she offered me a fight. She offered me a life that was harder, more painful in some ways, than the death I was craving. She handed me a reason. It wasn't a gentle reason. It was a starving, freezing, desperate reason. It was her children. He turned and looked at Alara, and for the first time, in front of the entire town, he let his heart show in his eyes. Mr. Henderson sees a broken man. She saw a man who could still chop wood. He sees a beggar woman. I see a woman who can make a home out of nothing but dust and determination. He wants to talk about what's suitable. I'll tell you what's suitable. A child's laughter in a silent house. The smell of bread baking in a cold kitchen. A roof that doesn't leak. A fire in the hearth. That is suitable. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the room, challenging every single person there. This is my ranch. These are my children. This is my family. The word, spoken aloud for the first time, hung in the air, momentous and fragile and powerful all at once. And you will take it all over my dead body. A body that I promise you, I will not be putting in the ground myself. He sat down. The silence in the saloon was absolute. It was a sacred ringing silence. Judge Davies cleared his throat. He looked at Henderson, whose smug confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, slack-jawed shock. He looked at Jedediah and Alara, sitting side by side, their hands now tightly clasped on the table. In my years on the bench, the judge said slowly, his voice filling the room, I have seen families bound by law, by blood, and by name. I have seen those same families torn apart by greed and hatred. A family is not a piece of paper filed at the courthouse. A home is not just a collection of wood and nails. He looked directly at Jedediah and Alara. A family is a shelter. And it seems to me you two have built a mighty strong one. He banged his gavel on the table, the sound making everyone jump. Petition dismissed. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the room, Mrs. Olson, the blacksmith's wife, said a loud, firm amen. It broke the spell. A Jinji. Wave of murmurs and nods swept through the crowd. People were turning to look at Henderson with open contempt. He shrank in his chair, his face ashen. The battle was over. Jedediah and Alara walked out of the saloon and into the bright, cold sunlight. The townspeople parted to let them pass, their faces no longer filled with judgment, but with a new, profound respect. They had walked into the saloon as outcasts. They walked out as a family, forged in public, legitimized not by law, but by love's fierce, stubborn will to live. They did not get married in a church. There was no white dress, no fancy ceremony. One afternoon in the late spring, as the prairie was exploding into a riot of green and wildflowers, they stood on the porch of the cabin, the one he had built with his own hands and she had reclaimed with hers. The children, Caleb and Sarah, stood beside them, holding jars filled with fireflies they had just caught. Sheriff Brody, looking slightly uncomfortable in his Sunday best, officiated, his voice a low rumble as he read the simple words from his book. Mrs. Olson was their witness, her broad, kind face beaming. When the sheriff said, I now pronounce you man and wife, Jedediah did not kiss Alara with a fiery passion. He turned to her, and with a tenderness that brought tears to Mrs. Olson's eyes, he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. She smiled at him, a real, unguarded smile that lit up her whole being. It was a promise far deeper than any kiss. That night, after the children were asleep, they stood on the porch again, watching the stars emerge in the vast dark sky. The ranch was alive around them. The fields were plowed, the cattle were healthy, and the sound of crickets had replaced the sound of the wind howling through cracks in the walls. The hole Jedediah had dug had long since been filled in, and now wild prairie grass grew over the spot, erasing the scar. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. They had built this life together, piece by painful piece, choice by difficult choice. It was not a life free of scars. Their ghosts were still with them, but they were no longer haunting the shadows. They were part of the story, the foundation, upon which this new improbable love had been built. Jedediah looked out at the land, his land. He saw the faint, warm glow of the lamplight in the cabin window where their children slept safely. He felt the steady, warm presence of the woman whose hand rested in his, a hand that had scrubbed his floors, mended his clothes, and pulled him back from the brink. And he finally understood. A grave was not a hole in the ground. It was a life, without love to fill it, and his was at last overflowing.